Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to Chapter 17. Remember, we are doing the survey of life. We're talking about all living things. The current living things we're talking about are plants. And we just started talking about the adaptations that plants need to make the transition from water to land. Remember, there's a lot of advantages for living on land. There's more sunlight, there's more carbon dioxide. There's more nutrients. The problem with living on land is there's nothing to hold you up. There's because in water, the water holds you up. There's no way to get water because all the water's in the ground, so you have to have a way of getting the water. And third is there is a hole in my brain where I'm supposed to remember what the third thing is. You can't spread your gametes. That's the third problem, is being able to spread the gametes. So a couple of solutions to the problem. What plants needed to be able to move on land, and that is they had to have roots. The job of roots is to absorb water from the soil and to bring it in to the plant. Now that it's in the plant, now I got to move it. And that's where vascular tissue comes from. Vascular tissue is for moving water and stuff about the plant. The xylem's job is to transport water and minerals from the roots out to the leaves, and the job of phloem is to transport sugars from the leaves down to the rest of the plant. Well, that solves the water problem. Now we got to solve the gravity problem. And the way that plants solve this gravity problem is this thing called a rigid cell wall. Plants have rigid cell walls. We talked about this a long time ago in Biology 1, and I said, look, you're an animal. Don't call your cells, don't call the skin, the wrapper around your cells, don't call it a cell wall, because it's not. A cell wall is a rigid structure. This is made of cell walls, because this is made of wood. Wood is made of rigid cell walls. Why did plants make these rigid cell walls? They made them to resist gravity so they could stand up and not flop over on the ground. The rigid cell wall was, its job is to resist gravity. Next, we're going to revisit the water problem again. Because once you get the water, you want to keep the water. And so plants have this stuff called cuticle. Cuticle is, if you've ever held a magnolia leaf or a holly leaf, you notice how it's really super shiny on top? That shine that you see on top is cuticle. It's not this cuticle. It's a waxy covering that the plants coat their leaves with to reduce water loss. As long as the plant is photosynthesizing, it's going to lose water. What's one of the problems for living on land? One of the problems for living on land is there's not enough water. So they need any water that they get, they want to keep. So cuticle, very much like you got oil on your skin to hold water in you. This is wax they put on their skin to hold water in them, cuticle. How do they solve the gamete dispersion problem? Remember we talked about this last time. We said that, when you live in water, the female releases her eggs and the male just releases his sperm near each other. And then the sperm just swims the eggs and bam, we've made new life. And you can't do that on land. The egg is going to fall on the ground and it's going to dry up and die. And the sperm falls on the ground and it's going to do the same thing. It's going to dry up and die. So you've got to be able to somehow get these two things together. Pollen is how plants solve the gamete dispersion issue. The egg has to have a lot of structures in it. It needs basically all of the cellular machinery necessary to support life, and that's really difficult to transport. So it's best if the female just hangs on to the egg. Pollen, on the other hand, really just has to be just a packet of DNA. That's all it needs to be. It doesn't have to be a living cell. It is in most cases, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a living cell. It just needs to be a packet of DNA. And so pollen it's inappropriate to call it plant sperm because the sperm is a special structure. It's a living cell that has, that can live and therefore can die. But if you imagine that that sperm is just the male sex cell, it's how the male transports DNA to the female, then you can imagine that pollen is kind of like plant sperm. Now, it doesn't have a tail on it like sperm does. It's just basically a little clump of DNA, essentially, with a little wrapper around it. And because it's just a packet of DNA with a wrapper around it, it's very light and it's very small. It can be transported very easily by the wind and other things. It's late May now. What does your car look like in March? In March, your car takes on an orange or yellow tint because of all of the pollen. Your sinuses are probably miserable in March and April. Your sinuses are probably miserable now because of pollen. Pollen it's inappropriate to call it plant sperm, but it's plant sperm. All over your car, all in the wind, all up your nose. All right? Plant male reproductive cell, and it just goes everywhere. The last thing is enclosed reproductive organs. This kind of creates one problem, an additional problem, but it solves a second one, and that is that the female just can't lay there with the egg sitting out, because we already talked about this. We said that the egg is very fragile and the egg can dry out and die really easy. So the egg has to be kept inside of an organ that will keep it moist, that will keep it wet, that will keep it from drying out. Well, now if I'm hiding this egg thing, it makes it even harder to get the pollen, to get the male sex cell to the egg. But what it solves is it solves the dehydration problem for the egg. It prevents the egg from drying out. So enclosed sex organs. The enclosed sex organs are flowers and cones. A pine cone is a sex organ. What you imagine when you think of a pine cone, you think of the female reproductive structure for a pine tree. That each one of those little scales, each one of those little scales that comes off of the pine cone, at the base of that scale is a seed. And when the cone is green, the pollen hits it, and the pollen travels down into the base of the cone. It will fertilize that egg. When you see the brown cone, what has happened is the pine seed, the pine nut, has been released and has been spread. It's now dead, it's now useless. But the job of that cone, the green cone, is to be this enclosed sex organ, to protect that egg, to protect that little seed before it forms, before it's ready to be released. So, enclosed sex organs. This graphic is showing how plants made it out on land. If I've got a plant that lives in water, dispersing the sex organs, the sex cells is really easy. Again, the male and female just release their sex cells next to each other. If I live in water, I don't have to support my own weight. And if I live in water, I don't have to worry about water. But what are the problems for living in water? The problems are not enough nutrients. The problems are not enough carbon dioxide. The problem is not enough light. If I come out on land, well, that's great. I solved those problems. There's now plenty of light. There's now plenty of carbon dioxide, and there's actually lots of minerals. But what problems do I have now? The problems that I have now is I can't stand up. I can't spread my genes. And I can't get water. So plants had to develop these things called roots that will absorb water. They had to develop vascular tissues to be able to transport that water from the dirt out into the rest of the plant. They had to develop a rigid cell wall. They had to develop something that helps them to stand up and resist gravity. And then finally, they had to come up with a way of reproducing, and we'll talk about pollen and seeds and spores and stuff a little bit later. But this is just illustrating how plants went from being totally aquatic to coming out on land and being simple plants.